Because whenever, anywhere in the world, a person raises a voice, a person is thrown out of an institution, a person is ostracized for making any kind of choice in life which society condemns, that person becomes Shelley. That person becomes the West Wind. Hello and welcome back to Nibble Pop. Today in this video, we will be looking at another very famous romantic poem which is called Ode to the West Wind. It is by Percy Bysshe Shelley, and in this video, we are going to look at not just the text but also the context, the theme, and the structure of the poem, so that by the end of this video, you will have a complete understanding of what the poem is about and why the poem is written the way it was. This is Monami Mukherjee. Welcome once again. Now, if you have watched the video on the background of romantic age in general, which we have already published, you more or less know about the kind of social and philosophical background against which Shelley's mind was growing up, against which he was writing. To put it in a nutshell, it was kind of a moment in history when man was starting to rebel not just against the institutions, not just against some political power in general, but against their own impulses, against their own conservative ideas. Shelley might be seen as the epitome of everything that is rebellious. If you look at his life, he was born in 1792, just 3 years after the mighty revolution, the French Revolution. Then he went on, when he grew up, to study at the universities, Oxford University. What is remarkable is that just at the age of 19, he was expelled from his university. Now, all of you who are now pursuing your college studies or are planning to get into universities, how many of you are doing it just to get expelled from it? We don't do that, right? But Shelley was a man who did not want to compromise with the ideas he was forming in his mind, the kind of rebellious, challenging, philosophical outpourings that he prioritized were very important for him. What kind of revolution did he talk about? Why was he expelled from his university? Well, he wrote a book which was like he was professing the necessity of atheism. And during the time when he was writing it, Christianity was still the cornerstone. It was the solid foundation on which social beliefs were raised or social beliefs were constructed. Therefore, Shelley was seen as not just a glamorized rebel at that point. Now he is considered a rebellious man, a glamorous, heroic persona. But back then he was considered to be a despicable fellow who doesn't have any regard not just for religious beliefs or religious values, but social conventions as well. And society always is scared of anybody who breaks conventions. What conventions did he break? For one, when he was expelled the same year, he ran away with a girl, Harriet, and he got married. Now, that's a very tender age to get married, isn't it? 19. But it was not the kind of marriage which he was expecting it to be. And it didn't work out. It did not. For 2 years, he somehow managed to stay with her, after which he fell in love with this lady called Mary. And she was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, the feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft. Since Shelley was already married, William Godwin was not enthusiastic about this kind of relationship and he simply forbade it. Shelley eloped with Mary and they went off to different places, and they had a turbulent relationship. It was not a smooth one. Shelley was not a person with whom people could have stable, smooth, happily ever after kind of relationship, because he was always having these disturbing thoughts in him. He loved to question everything, every kind of convention, and love, marriage, all these things are conventions. So he is a person who did not believe in the institution of marriage, but he still married twice, we can say. Like after some days, Harriet, she expired, and Shelley got married to Mary. This Mary Shelley became the celebrated writer later when she wrote and published books like Frankenstein. We will talk about those things when we will talk about Frankenstein someday, maybe. Shelley's reputation went so down, like he became so notorious, it was impossible for him to continue living in England, and he escaped with his family to Italy. He had children, but somehow he continued to suffer through depressive spells. Firstly, because he was frustrated that he could not bring about the kind of change he wanted to bring about in the thought processes, in the philosophical way of thinking of his native people. So he could not bring about the kind of change in English men's thoughts which he wanted to. And when you are having all these revolutionary ideas and you are confined, you're isolated, and you're forced to stay in a place away from home, then you do feel depressed and even scared. Later on, Shelley died in an accident on a boat, on a vessel in the Mediterranean. There was a storm and his body drowned. And it was a definitely sad death, and he was carrying a poem by Keats in his pocket when he died. And when he died, he was not even 30. He was 1 month short of being 30. So within a span of something around a decade, Shelley wrote things which has immortalized him. Ode to the West Wind is often considered the lyric of the lyrics, and it contains the cream of his ideas, the crux of his belief. So, if you understand what he's saying in this poem, you will understand why he felt the way he did and what change did he want to bring about in this world. So, this is a poem which has a universal appeal. Like we in the 21st century will definitely understand what he was trying to say. We too feel at times things which he is talking about in this poem. But this poem is essentially a deeply personal one when it came to Shelley. And this is what romantic poetry is about: the extreme connection, the personal connection that a poet feels with his work. This is something which we never saw in the neoclassical poets. All right. So, not spending any more time on the background, let's jump to the context. Now, when you look at any poem, especially as I was telling you, that in a romantic poet, you will always find a deeper personal connection or deeper personal reason for writing a poem. It's not like he suddenly had this thought that, okay, there's a west wind blowing and let me write on it. No, it's not that. It was definitely not a west wind that triggered him. Something was happening at that time because of which he wrote this. Now, what was that something? If you look at the date of publication, it was 1820, but when he wrote it, it was around 1819. Now, 1819, so far as the history of England is concerned, is known for the event called Peterloo Massacre. Now, what is this Peterloo Massacre? After the end of the Napoleonic Wars around 1815, there was a surge in different kinds of problems. What kind of problems? Unemployment, famine, poverty. So there was a kind of economic crisis that England was going through. This led to a kind of political radicalism. People started to talk against the existing government, their policies, and they wanted certain reforms. Specifically, one particular group the Manchester Patriotic Union, they protested in order to have certain political reforms, certain parliamentary reforms, so that their economic situations, the situation of common man, could be improved in England. Now, we know that demonstrations are part of any kind of revolt in a democratic world. So, this union, they also arranged for a demonstration. Now, when they were demonstrating in St. Peter's Field, local magistrates, they sent the military to suppress that, to disperse the crowd. So there were thousands of people who gathered there. The cavalry charged at them, and there was a kind of chaos that was not at all desirable. And not just chaos, there were actually 700 people were injured, 15 were killed. This came to be known as the Peterloo Massacre. Why was it called the Peterloo Massacre? It was kind of an ironic naming after Napoleon's Waterloo Massacre, which was also a very deadly event in history. So, 1819 was a time when England was going through a lot of crises on a political level, social level. And during 1819, Shelley was away. Okay, he had escaped England by then. Now imagine that you are a revolutionary person. You have wanted change in society for long and you have struggled because of this. And you suddenly see that your home, your native place, it has become a battlefield where people are shouting, and you want to go there and participate, don't you? But situations, circumstances have made this impossible for him to return as yet. And therefore, he wanted to reach out to his native people, to reach out to those rebellious souls in England, to somehow pass on this message of inspiration, because he always felt that he had a commitment. As a poet, his commitment was to fight for liberty, democracy, and everything. Like we had discussed this, right, during our discussion on French Revolution, that monarchy is not the absolute be all and end all of governance. That man has a right because of being human, not because of being born rich. And Shelley was suffering through what, nowadays we use this term FOMO, fear of missing out. And that fear was a depressive thing for Shelley because he was intensely attached to the idea of rebellion. West wind is a wind which blows from the west to the east, and it blows during the winter. So when he was writing this poem, this was the beginning of the winter season, and somehow he felt that the west wind, which blows from one country to another, which doesn't have any border to think about, doesn't have any limitations to be worried about like he does. The west wind is capable of dispersing his message to the world, and this urgency in him to reach out to his country, that led to the writing of this beautiful poem. Now, with this context in mind, let's just jump into the poem. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. In the very first line, he is addressing the west wind directly. Now, the west wind is not a human being, so it cannot actually hear us. It is an inanimate object, but he is addressing the west wind. Now, it's natural for romantic poets like Shelley to imagine powerful natural objects like the west wind as a sentient being, somebody who can sense others' presence, somebody who can understand others. So, west wind is, you can say, if not personified, he's not talking to the west wind as if west wind is a human being. He's not doing that. He is talking to the west wind as if the west wind is like a god or a deity. So you can say it's not a personification, it's a deification. Okay, so he is addressing the west wind, and when a poem is written at the form of an address, an impassioned address full of emotion. That is called an ode. So this is an ode because it is addressed to an inanimate object with a lot of emotion in him. Sometimes odes are addressed to real people, but here it refers to an inanimate object. So what is the west wind doing here? The west wind is called the breath of autumn's being. So autumn is again imagined to be a living thing, and west wind is like its breath because west wind blows during the autumn. Thou from whose unseen presence, of course, the wind, you cannot see the wind as such, you can see the effect of wind. You can see that, okay, the leaves are falling, which means the wind is carrying them. And the leaves are driven away. How? Like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. So whenever a place is haunted, superstitious people, they call these enchanters who come and do their anti-haunting things, and the ghosts, they run away. So leaves are also scared of the west wind and flying away. But that's not the fact, is it? The leaves are flying away because the wind is simply sweeping them off. But this is a romantic poet looking at a scene which otherwise we will not even notice in that way. When we see leaves being blown away by winds, we simply call it leaves being blown away by winds by law of physics. But Shelley loves to look into things, to infuse a kind of logic behind things, a kind of imagination which makes him visualize autumn as a living thing, west wind as a living thing, leaves as living things who have conscious choices to make. They are running away from the wind. And these leaves are described as yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes. When you use these colors, yellow, red, they are vibrant colors. But in context of leaves, when you say a leaf is yellow, red, black, then this is a sign of decay, death. A leaf is green when it is alive. When it's dying, it becomes yellow and pale. And therefore, they are called pestilence-stricken multitude. Pestilence means a mass-scale disease. So these leaves which are falling, they are infected with death. O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, not just leaves, the wind, it drives away the seeds and then takes them to these places where they will be buried under these fallen leaves. And then what will happen? Then winter will come and there will be snow, and those seeds will wait patiently till spring arrives. Now this whole process is described so beautifully here. How? Let's see. The winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave. See, that metaphor of death is continuing. So the leaves are like ghosts. They are all pale and withered. Now these seeds, they also look like dead bodies. You can't even visualize any life in them. They look so dried and withered, and they lie low inside their graves. But for trees, earthly grave is nothing but a place for revival. They are not like human beings who simply rot away. Trees know how to lead to life through their graves. So this is what the seeds do. Until thine azure sister, the wind which blows during the spring, is called the azure sister of the west wind. And that wind is a gentle wind, it's a warm wind, and it brings in a lot of energy and life back to this earth. Thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth. So as if during the winter, the earth is laid asleep in a suspended mode, and then this spring wind comes, blows her musical instrument, and everything wakes up to this spring renewal. And that is the moment he's talking about here. And fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air with living hues and colors. plain and hill. So everywhere, the spring generates this kind of magic of renewal when that spring wind arrives. But till then, these seeds will be waiting. Okay. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, here, oh here. So, till that moment arrives when this renewal takes place, when this rebirth takes place, the west wind's function is not just to destroy, but also to preserve. Because unless the west wind manages to preserve the integrity of the seeds, they will never mature into new life when the spring comes. Now, this is a very interesting play of words, destroyer and preserver. And now, being from the Indian subcontinent, I somehow related to the idea of Vishnu and Shiva, part of that trilogy, where one god is responsible for destroying the world, that is Shiva, and one god is responsible for preserving everything. In Shelley, we see that God is again, as in Wordsworth, not just the Christian God, tied to a cross. For these poets, divinity is something which is far more universal than one single religion. They believe that divinity manifests itself. The power of God manifests itself through these agents like the west wind. So, west wind becomes an extension of divinity. And yes, the poet who was talking about atheism when he was 19 and he was thrown out of the university for it, he was talking about a certain kind of atheism. He was not talking about not believing in anything. He was talking about believing in the right thing. And therefore, when he says that the west wind is the destroyer and preserver, he is not just talking about the west wind. He is talking about the same kind of thing which Wordsworth was talking about in Tintern Abbey, something that rolls through everything, that divine power of nature. Now, when you look at this stanza and to this poem as a whole, you would notice that there are 5 stanzas, just like the first one, which we have already read. And each stanza has a certain symmetrical structure, and there is hardly any variation. They are shaped as if they are shaped as cantos, like acts. There is a rising action, and there is a climax, and there is a realization at the end. So it's shaped like almost a dramatic revelation. And here we see that every stanza serves 2 purposes. First is he talks about the west wind, more particularly about a certain quality about the west wind, about a specific action of the west wind, and then he goes on to make an appeal. So in each stanza we have 2 parts. For example, in the first stanza, which we have read, first is talking about the effect of the west wind on the leaves and the seeds. Okay, the way they are driven away towards a burial where they lay low and they eventually become new life. So this is an effect of west wind on the leaves. The second thing that he's doing here is he's making an appeal. What appeal? Hear, oh hear. This means that he's making a prayer to be heard. Now this is very natural because in an isolated exile, all he wanted was to be heard, and he wants the west wind to hear him first. Otherwise, how can the west wind take his message to his near and dear ones? In the second stanza, things get more interesting. Thou on whose stream amid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. He is taking us to the sky now. And even there's a continuation from the first stanza. The first stanza was about leaves. When he looks at the sky, that idea of leaves being driven away is present even there. Here, the clouds are imagined to be leaves. So in the first stanza, leaves are imagined to be ghosts. Here, the clouds are imagined to be leaves. So there is this strange kind of link between one stanza and the other. Now, from where do these clouds come? shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean. So he imagines the heaven and ocean as a mighty tree from whose branches these clouds are torn off by the wind. Angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad. He does not imagine the clouds just as decaying leaves. He also imagines a wild woman's hair on the sky, and not just any wild woman. He's talking about the Maenad. Maenads were the lady attendants to Lord Bacchus, the Greek god Bacchus, Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of wine and creativity. We have talked about Dionysus at length on different occasions. Maenads are considered to be furious women, crazy women, and their hair was even crazier. So when he is comparing the clouds and this whole scenario on the sky to this fierce hair of the Maenads, then he is not talking about a calm sky. He's talking about a stormy sky. Now, again, if you are a person from West Bengal or a person from eastern part of India, you would have problem understanding how a person associates autumn with storm, because here in our geographical location we do not have a stormy autumn. But just think about what happens during spring here. Think about what in Bengali we call Kal Boishakhi and the poems that Tagore wrote on them. Okay, the same kind of wildness that nature takes on is seen in the west wind in England. So here he is talking about a stormy sky where the clouds look like angry wild hair. Even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, horizon is the farthest point. It's an imaginary line which divides the sky from the land. When you make a drawing, you make that imaginary line, right, actually visible, where the sky meets the land. That is the horizon. And zenith is, if you look straight up when you're standing under the sky, you look at the highest point above your head. That is the zenith. So if you cover the distance between zenith and the horizon, it practically takes the entire part which you can see in front of you. This whole dome in front of you, imaginary dome in front of you. And this whole part is cloudy and stormy. So he's saying from the dim verge of the horizon, dim because it's cloudy and stormy, you cannot see it properly, it's dim, to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm. Now, he has already compared this stormy sky to this hair, and therefore, locks of the approaching storm is a perfect metaphor here. Thou dirge of the dying year. Dirge is kind of the chantings or the prayers which are made after somebody's death during the funeral. The west wind is compared to the dirge. So it's like a death song. Death song of who? Who is dying? Well, the whole year is dying. It's talking about December. It's talking about the end of the year, because December is not just the end of the year so far as the calendar is concerned. It's also the time when everything ends, and then there's a moment of suspension in January, and then in February the spring arrives, right? So he's saying, thou dirge of the dying year, because it's now December, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre. So if December is seen as a grave, this is the closing night, maybe 31st December, is the small little dome that is constructed on that grave. So it's like a topping on a cake. He's talking it in that term, although he's talking about death and grave and making this analogy of the west wind with the death song. The west wind brings in the first stanza we have seen that it brings in this message of death. And in the second canto or second part, also we see the same kind of death and decay that is brought in, and not just a peaceful death, it's a destructive death that the west wind is bringing. Vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst, almost like the apocalypse, the end of the world, where there will be hail and storm and fire. That kind of an end is there when December arrives, when the west wind arrives. But the strange thing is that what is the difference between apocalypse and this death? It looks similar, destructive. In case of apocalypse, there is no further time or further life allowed or assured, other than the virtuous people, they will go to heaven, and the sinful people, they'll go to hell. That is apocalypse, the judgment day, doomsday. This is not judgment day. There is no judgment here. The west wind will come and simply wipe everything away. That is frightening, isn't it? Which means that if a tree says, I am a good tree, don't kill me, don't kill my leaves, the west wind won't hear. If a cloud says, I've been a good cloud, I have shed good water on good earth, please spare me, the west wind would not listen. There is no judgment here. It is universal. The west wind will have the same effect on everything, the effect of ending. And what is the plus side to it? The plus side is nobody will be spared death and nobody will be denied a resurrection. What kind of resurrection? Will come to that. So in the second stanza, we have the effect of the wind on the clouds, that is on the sky, the weather, the storm and everything. Third stanza takes us to a different plane altogether. It takes us to the ocean, to the sea. Thou who didst waken from his dreams the blue Mediterranean, where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams, beside a pumice isle in Bai's Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day. This whole first part of the third stanza gives off a feeling of calmness, sleep, and look at all those L sounds, lay, lulled, coil, crystalline. These words, they generate a kind of hypnotizing calmness. And what is he talking about here? He's talking about the Mediterranean Sea, which is lying calmly, sleeping, and dreaming of towers and castles. Why towers and palaces? Mediterranean is supposed to be a place, the sea, under which there are evidences of lost civilizations, towns and cities which submerged and drowned and were destroyed eventually. So this sea, which is now sleeping, is like kind of having dreams about the things which are there in its depth. And what has happened to those towers and cities now? They are overgrown with mosses. Okay. So every man made thing that was glorious someday has now been claimed by nature, almost like that Tintern Abbey, which was once the seat of religious frantic activities, that has now become a ruin. So that Tintern Abbey was a ruin on earth. These palaces and towers are ruins under the sea. And of course, most of these are imaginary, but still, they are real facts. Pumice Isle means any kind of island that is formed by deposit of lava. Now, lava is something which you get from volcanoes, a destructive thing. Now, see how he is using these words to give us these hints and suggestions. He's talking about an island. An island is a place on which you do set up a civilization, a home, and that place is built out of destruction, because when a volcano erupts, it destroys things. So, on one hand, that volcano must have destroyed some cities, when it erupted, but on the other hand, it gave birth to this island on which new hopes will be cultivated, new civilizations will be formed. So even here in this small little space of one single line, Pumice Island by his bay, he is giving us this idea of the power of nature to create even when it destroys. So these old palaces and towers are all overgrown with azure, moss and flowers, so sweet, the sense faints picturing them. So this whole thing, this hypnotism, makes a person imagining these towers and palaces under the water feel dizzy almost. But is he describing something which is peaceful and calm? Come to the first part of this. He said, "Thou who didst waken from his dreams," which means that this whole idea of a calm sleep is a past thing. The Mediterranean was dreaming, was in a calm state, and now the west wind has wakened him up. And what happens when the Mediterranean wakes up? For that, you have to think about the geographical location of the Mediterranean Sea. Unlike the Pacific Ocean, unlike the Indian Ocean, where you have lots of space for that water to move, the Mediterranean Sea is rather enclosed on all sides by land bodies. We have continents and countries around the Mediterranean, which makes it kind of an enclosed water space. So when there's a lot of wind coming up, the waves have nowhere to simply move on. It cannot connect to any other ocean. There is a crisis in that water stream that happens, and there is a lot of surge. You have tall waves, and therefore storm in Mediterranean is far more dangerous than a storm in, say, the Pacific Ocean or even the Indian Ocean. So don't feel like it's a sea and that's an ocean, so ocean is bigger, so that it's more dangerous. No, it's not that. You have greater loss, especially because it's also a trade route. Okay, so there is a lot of traffic through the Mediterranean. And therefore, the storm hits more when it comes to this one sea. So when this sea, which is otherwise a calm one, is affected by the wind, it totally changes its whole attitude. It becomes aggressive and dangerous. And then he's talking about Atlantic. "Thou for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms." So now he's talking about a huge storm that also affects the Atlantic. "While far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods," oozy because the greenery underneath the ocean, the vegetation underwater, they are always oozing out moisture. They're filled with moisture. "Oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean." Sapless foliage because unlike the vegetation on earth, on the surface of the earth, the vegetation on the ocean floor, they are different. They do not have the sap because they do not have the same kind of biological structure as the normal, earthly vegetation has. And when these plants underneath the surface of the ocean, on the ocean bed, they sense that there is a storm overhead, it affects them too. So the waves, they do not form just on the surface. The west wind has the capability of penetrating the core of the ocean to reach those plants and vegetation layers who also react to that wind. So west wind brings a kind of change not to the surface but from the core. And what happens to these sapless foliage? "Know thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear." So again, a beautiful use of alliteration here. Grow grey with fear. This word grey, again associated with decay, death, brings in a kind of melancholy and at the same time a kind of pain. The ocean plants, they are scared and tremble and they spoil themselves over here. So these plants are quivering, trembling, and it's as if the whole water body is despoiling itself. So this is a scene which completely destroys the kind of calm which is otherwise created in the first part of this stanza. So while the first stanza deals with the leaves or the effect of the wind on the leaves, the second stanza deals with the effect of the wind on the air. The third stanza deals with the effect of wind on water, or more specifically on the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Fourth stanza is different. How? If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable. He brings things to himself. This is a personal stanza. Is it a change in the way he's looking at West Wind? No. Because essentially, again, we will go back to Wordsworth, because when I was talking about Tintern Abbey, I had said that this is the primary poem of romantic movement. He had said everything in that poem. He had said that nature flows through all things, rolls through all things. And finally, he had talked about man, which means that man is essentially an extension of nature, not away from it, not distant from it, not separated from it. And Shelley is talking exactly of the same thing. He's saying that the wind has effect on the leaves, on the surface of water, on air. So why not on me? I am also a part of nature. I also have a relationship with this energy of nature. And the sequence which he is mentioning here, dead leaf, swift cloud, and wave, it follows or it coincides with the sequence of stanzas. First stanza was on leaf, second stanza was on cloud, and third stanza was on wave. So he maintains that order even in this appeal. This means that while he was talking about the leaf, the cloud, and wave, he was actually talking about himself. Because he felt that in him he carried the qualities of these things. He is like that dead leaf, withering leaf, and then he is like that cloud who has the potential of bringing in a lot of storm. And then he is that wave which wants to churn itself out of some sleep, of some dreamy state, because he is a rebellious spirit. And this recurrent use of if, it kind of shows a tendency to wistful thinking. He wants to be all these things, but he is not yet everything that he wants to be. He is not yet the cloud that can fully participate in the power of the wind. Then he says, only less free than thou. He wants to be with the wind, but he knows that, unlike the wind, he is not free. The wind is free. The wind can go anywhere. Well, teachers of geography would say that no, winds cannot go everywhere. They are actually controlled by high pressure and low pressure areas, which is controlled by movement of earth and the sunlight falling obliquely or directly on a place and many other things. But no, in the romantic worldview, the wind is a free agent. It symbolizes freedom, okay, flying free as a wind. Oh, uncontrollable. Yes, the wind is uncontrollable if you're talking about human beings trying to control it. Human beings have not yet been able to control winds. Yes, they are able to guard themselves against winds. They are able to channelize wind to generate electricity even, but they cannot control wind. And something which is beyond human control, something which is beyond control of society is exciting for Shelley, is appealing for Shelley, because he hates to be controlled. And society does that to him. If even I were as in my boyhood, when remember he was a rebellious person when he started college. This is 1819 when he was writing this, and he was thrown out of university in 1811. So that was like the boyhood he is referring to here, perhaps, when he was a wild spirit. Nobody could control him. He married a girl and he married another girl, and he rejected every restriction of the society. But now, in isolation, he is not able to command that kind of free energy which he had when he was young. We had similar kind of emotion in Wordsworth when he was saying that when I was young, I could run away like a roe and I looked at nature. But that is a calm way of looking at things. He's talking about actually rebelling, bringing about a storm of change. I were as in my boyhood and could be the comrade of thy wandering over heaven. Comrade means friend, companion, equal. So he was equal with the wind. And well, if you are equal with something, you don't call that thing God, do you? That is something he says here. As then, when to outstrip thy sky speed, scarce seemed a vision. I could even manage to run so fast that I would go faster than the wind. When you grow a little bit old, Shelley is not old here. He is what? In his late 20s? Still, he looks at his boyhood as a time when he could rush across the continents even. And then he says that if I were that young now, I wouldn't pray to you, appeal to you. I wouldn't care. Oh, that's a lot of attitude here. I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Okay, thankfully, the west wind didn't hear him, because then the west wind will be very angry. It would say that, oh, you're powerless, that's why you're praying. Otherwise, you wouldn't care about me. Honestly, maybe the west wind heard him because Shelley died in a sea storm in the Mediterranean, not during the autumn, but during summer. Maybe he should have been a little bit more respectful towards the west wind. At least would have said that, okay, in my boyhood, I was as energetic as you. And as Wordsworth said, that I didn't appreciate nature then. Today I appreciate nature more. But he is saying that if I was that, I wouldn't appreciate you now. I wouldn't care about you now. And well, nature took revenge perhaps. Okay, let's come back here. I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. Now he's praying. He's praying to be rejuvenated. Just like the leaf which dies and becomes new again. A wave, a leaf, a cloud. And look at the sequence here. He has mixed the sequence up. The stanzaic progression was leaf, cloud, wave. Here he is saying wave, leaf, cloud. So he is not even going backwards. He is simply making a mix up here. Deliberate, unconscious, we don't know. Or maybe he's too frenzied now, he's praying. And when Shelley is becoming personal here, he does not become a meticulous writer. He is not a person who makes a lot of corrections. He is more like spontaneous overflow kind of guy. Keats is a meticulous writer. Coleridge is extremely meticulous. Shelley is more like spontaneous because he wants to be like the west wind, doesn't want to be controlled even by things like what should be this and what should be that. And this is one of the rarest poems where he has a stanzaic structure. I will talk about the stanzaic structure at the end, just bear with me. Okay, come down to this. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. A heavy weight of ours has chained and bowed one too like thee. I was also like you. And this life, heavy weight of ours, is like a burden. I meant to carry it. It has chained and bowed me. And life, which looks like a rose, is basically a bed of thorns. I fall upon it, thinking that life is rose. But I only feel pain because it's all full of thorns. So Shelley is full of so much of grand imagery, and he twists and changes the way these images have been used by poets till now. Rose doesn't become rosy here, it becomes thorny here. He doesn't even use the word rose here. Make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? Fifth stanza is about complete identification, complete assimilation. In fourth stanza, there is still some distance between him and the wind. Now he wants to become the wind, or wants the wind to become him. So here the west wind ceases to be a geographical, natural, physical, real thing. It becomes a metaphor of what? Of rebellious force which changes things. He wants to become this lyre, this musical instrument. Just like the forest becomes a musical instrument when the wind blows through it, and the forest makes beautiful rustling sounds, even moaning sounds when the wind passes through. He wants to become the voice through which the west wind will bring about the change. What if my leaves are falling like its own? Now, this what if, it can mean two things. One is he is certain, he is sure, and he's trying to say, what if? What if my leaves are falling? What if I am decaying? What if I'm dying? I can still sing like the forest sings in autumn. Not unlike the way Keats says, thou hast thy music too. The second way of looking at this expression, what if, means he is a little bit scared. What if my leaves are falling like its own? Which means that I want to be the messenger, like the west wind, the messenger of change. But what if I am dying? What if I never be able to communicate what I want to? We don't know for certain what the real meaning of what if is, but it is possible that he means either of them. He still believes that doesn't matter if he doesn't have time enough. And it's sad because he did die a couple of years later. But back then, he was talking about passing the message of liberalism, democracy. The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both. Both means the forest and me. Whenever you come, the west wind, you make the forest sing. So you have come and you are making me sing. Singing means writing this poem. Will take from both a deep autumnal tone, the music of autumn. Why is the music of autumn sad but sweet? Sweet because, of course, it represents fulfillment, maturity, full harvest. So it is sweet, actually sweet, full of sweetness. All the fruits are sweet then. But on the other hand, it knows that this is temporary. This won't last. The winter is coming. And therefore, this idea of transience, that something will end, makes that thing sweet but sad. So there is a strange kind of thing happening here. We are usually nostalgic about our past. But here, autumn is giving you a moment when you are nostalgic about the present. This is going to be past soon. And then he makes that final appeal. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Is he calling the wind impetuous, or is he defining himself as the impetuous one? Again, a very ambiguous construction. He is saying, be thou me, and then he is putting a comma and saying, impetuous one. It might mean, you who are the impetuous one, the undefeatable one, the heroic one, you please become me. You help me out. Or it might also mean, you be me, I am impetuous one. That is again a bigger egoistic claim. And we were talking about Wordsworth being egoistic. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. He is calling his thoughts dead thoughts. Why dead? Because when you are having even the most powerful of thoughts but are unable to disperse it, unable to spread it, then those thoughts die inside your brains, no matter how fertile those thoughts are, no matter how powerful they are. So those thoughts are there in his brain, in his head, in his mind, and the wind will disperse it. Now you will ask me, how will a wind disperse a thought? This is not a wind he's talking about. He's talking about this poem. This poem, or not just this poem, his writings in general. His writings will disperse his thought among the universe or among the readers of this universe. Therefore, just stand back from the poem and look at this sentence. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe. Okay, which means he had thoughts, powerful thoughts, which the wind did not create. The wind is simply an agent of dispersal. He's simply using nature. For him, nature is not God. It is God so much as his thoughts are divine. Therefore, he is an atheist. He does not call anybody supreme. He is calling the west wind supreme because it is capable of making us understand his great thoughts. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, incantation means chanting a prayer. Incantation of this verse, this poem means this poem is like a prayer. Prayer not in the loose sense. It's like mantra, which you chant and magic happens. So he is calling the wind powerful, but he is calling himself powerful too. If the wind is divine, wind is powerful. More powerful becomes the verse which invokes the wind of change. So he is calling the wind divine, but his verse magical too. By the incantation of this verse, scatter, as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks my words among mankind. The hearth, the fireplace in him, it is not extinguished. It is simply subdued, and the wind will simply scatter away the dead ashes so that it will blaze again. So the wind will actually make us know how great Shelley's thoughts are. Beat through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. The wind will not make any prophecy. His prophecy will be transmitted by the wind, or rather by this poem on the wind. This is a different kind of attitude altogether. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So if winter comes, if the west wind comes with all its destruction and decay, does it only bring destruction? Does it only bring death? It also brings the promise of renewal. As I was telling you, the west wind is not judgmental. It is universal. It affects everything in the same way. And in the same way, the spring is not judgmental. It will make everything bloom impartially. Shelley makes this final appeal to the wind without bowing down completely. He is not surrendering himself totally. He's saying that I have a lot of power. I have a lot of potential, and I have the power to unleash your power, which will in turn make me more powerful. So this is a poem of relationship between the wind and Shelley. The wind means the ability to transmit your message, the revolting message. The poem structurally is an ode, of course, and structurally it is written in terza rima. Terza rima was a poetic structure that was used by Dante in his Divine Comedy. And it is strange because Shelley was writing this poem sitting in Italy, Florence, Dante's city. And of course, that might have triggered in him this need to write in terza rima. And he does make a certain kind of variation to it. And you have the rhyming scheme, if you look at it, as ABA, BCB, CDC, DED, EE. Every stanza, you have two lines at the end, which are rhyming couplets, which provide a kind of emphasis. And those are the lines where he's actually talking to the wind directly, not talking about the wind, talking to the wind, especially in the first three stanzas. So he makes a kind of slight modification, of course, but he's consistent. It's iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is usually the form adopted by sonnet writers, but this is not a sonnet, of course. This is a collection of five sonnets. You can read them as independent poems if you want, and they will make good sense. So he is making certain structural innovations here, like putting together five sonnets within a single theme with a almost climactic progression, and even each stanza there is a climactic progression in the final rhyming couplets of each stanza. The kind of images which he is using, they are also taken from different places. He's talking about Maenads, he's talking about Bays Bay, he's talking about general scenes from nature, okay, scenes which we all are familiar with. The tone is definitely personal, and at the same time you can identify with many of the emotions which he is using here. But above everything else, what I feel is that he is not just a poet of nature. He is a poet who is in nature, but a poet of mankind. When Plato was talking about poets who should be abolished from the republic, ideal republic, because they created this imaginary world and they were twice removed from reality, even there Plato had said this idea given about this idea about this cave man and this candle holding person, that poet is a person who will enlighten everybody. People in civilization, they like live in a cave, and the person who lights a candle to illuminate a path outside, that is the poet. So the poet will always talk about change, and a poet is always dangerous for stability of an existing order, stability of an existing system, existing government. So a true poet will always be banished from the ideal republic, from a perfect state. And best poets are born out of worst places, places where human voices are suppressed ruthlessly. Shelley wanted to talk about freedom, liberation. He wanted to talk about going beyond the confines of death. And strangely, when he died, his dead body, it was recovered, it was washed ashore. His friend Trelawney, he went there and he gives a very eerie record of what happened next. His body was cremated, it was burnt. There were certain quarantine rules going on during the time because of which the body had to be cremated. His body was burned down. His heart looked exceptionally small, rather. And after his body was burnt completely, the heart was intact. It was not burnt. Trelawney got hold of that heart. He actually got his hand burned. And later on, it's rumored that his wife, Shelley's wife, Mary, she had that heart and placed it in a book and kept it at her desk. I don't know, maybe she believed him totally that he will be revived, or maybe she believed that this one heart is completely indestructible. So that heart might have given her a lot of inspiration. I don't know. She wrote Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley was a person with a different kind of imagination altogether. That was a weird combo, right? Shelley and Mary. We don't know how far rejuvenation Shelley's unburnt heart had, but we do know that at least this poem is enough to immortalize him. That's the whole point of reading this poem, isn't it? To talk about Shelley, to talk not just about his unburnt heart, but actually to talk about his unburnt thoughts. Because whenever, anywhere in the world, a person raises a voice, a person is thrown out of an institution, a person is ostracized for making any kind of choice in life which society condemns, that person becomes Shelley. That person becomes the West Wind. And then that person understands what Shelley means when he says, "Be thou me," when he addresses the wind. So, how many of us have that in us? To ask the wind to become us, to try to be even an ounce of change, not to just go with the flow. I don't have that much of guts. So let's not be judgmental about the things we hear about our friends who make something bold in their lives. Those are the moments they become West Winds. I hope you have enjoyed today's class, and I know you have already subscribed to my channel. If you want to comment on any part of this poem, if you want any more clarification on any one passage or word or expression, please feel free to write that in the comment section. Your words of appreciation and your words of criticism help me grow as a person and as a teacher. So I'm grateful for all the love you're giving me. See you all in my next video with yet another poem from this era. Till then, stay happy, stay safe.